Okay, we are now on to the memorable line portion of the conclusion, which looks like slide number 8 currently. So I may be able to cover a few of these in these capsuled lectures. I don't know if I can get through all of them in one capsuled lecture. We'll see. I'll try to play this by ear just a little bit. So first off, let's start with one way to close is with a quotation. Here's one of my first warnings. If you are doing a memorable line of a quotation, please don't also have used tie back to the open quotation. The reason why is those are the same tool being used back to back, and it's not impossible to do that well, but it's difficult to do that well. One of the things that we want to sense will happen in these memorable lines is a shift in tone between the rest of the speech and the very last line that happens. Another warning is on that quotation, make sure it's not too long. Remember, this is memorable line, not memorable paragraph. Sometimes quotations can be very, very wordy. So you're looking for a quotation that's a single sentence, or at best 2 sentences if you're using it as a memorable line. Okay, it's not impossible to have done a tie back to the open quotation followed by memorable line quotation. If you do choose to do that because you are the artist of your speech, just make sure that one of the things you use is to distinguish your memorable line with a clear change in tone. Okay. Yeah. All right. Another thing that you can use is rhyme. In fact, in my face-to-face classes, and maybe you'll even see this on a few of the lectures, I try to close every class with a rhyme. It's a very, very simple thing to do. I think what I did in one of my speeches in college was something about church attendance, and I had some reasons that church attendance could be improved. And so I said something like this at the end: if we want to see more people, then we need to change what we do under the steeple. So people in steeple was what had rhymed in there. So yeah, so make sure that if you're using assonance, which is the technical name for that figure, or a rhyme, just make sure that it's fitting for the speech. You know, you wouldn't want to say something like, you know, my grandma was a heck of a dancer until she died from that terrible cancer. Right? That dancer cancer, oh, it doesn't feel good to be so lighthearted because there's something whimsical about a rhyme. All right. And don't take it too far either with too many rhymes. So yeah, a rhyme, that's one way to do things. All right. I think we're doing okay here on time. So let's go to different figures of speeches. All right. So by the way, there is a place online where you can find some of these figures of speeches. I only give a few figures of speeches. At one time, in order to pass like a Greek version of a Com 101 class, which they would have called rhetoric at that time, you would have had to know how to do, like, you know, hundreds of different figures of speeches for people. But there's a place called AmericanRhetoric.com, and on there they do have some figures of speeches. There it goes, figures in sound. And so you can learn more. Here's some of their, what they consider top ones. So let's see, 3, 6, 9. Looks like maybe there's 10 in each column, possibly 11. So it looks like 40 or maybe 44 or so top figures of speech. And some of them I talk about in here as well. Like, oh, which one did I use? Well, these are different versions of parallelisms. I guess there's a parallelism in here, and that's one of the ones that I talk about. And assonance is one that I talk about. So you can go there to find out more if you want. And there's also even a better site called Silva Rhetorica, and it is loaded with both the Latin and the Greek figures of speech, rhetorical figures. Look at all these different figures of speech. Now, I don't think you would have had to know this many in order to pass a Latin or a Greek class, but you probably would have at least had some kind of acquaintance with them, like synecdoche and that kind of stuff. So if you want to learn more, you can go to those sites. But for me, I talk about alliteration. So one of the things that I talk about with alliteration is the idea of combining the starts of words as a sound. So if you did a speech on drunk driving, so only dummies do drunk driving. That's the D kind of repeated. Don't take that too far either, like Peter Piper picked a peck of pickled peppers. because it becomes comedic if you go too far with it, unless you're trying to be comedic. If this fits the tone of the speech, that would be just fine. So alliteration, combining the beginnings of sounds at the beginning of things. Okay, parallelism. Parallelism is when you have a clause at the start and you basically have the same clause that's repeated with synonymous terms. So I put in the example, singing a song, humming a melody. Song and melody are highly related. Together we achieve, united we accomplish. That was actually a double because together and united are saying the same thing. And then I think it was achieve and accomplish. Those are basically the same thing. So it's a parallelism. The first sentence and the second sentence are basically saying the same thing in synonymous terms. Typically, the second clause will be a slightly more powerful or poetic version of what we have in the first clause. And that's so it's a technique called amplification, where the second phrase is a little more powerful. So parallelism, basically use the same sentence twice. And if one is more powerful, try to make that the second sentence. Antithesis is the opposite of a parallelism. It's where your first clause and your second clause say the exact opposite, common from the American Revolution. United, we stand. Divided, we fall. United and divided are opposite. Stand and fall are opposite. United, we stand. And then the second clause says the opposite. Divided, we fall. So that's antithesis, where the first sentence and the second sentence say the opposite thing. Chiasmus is a technique where you take a portion of the first clause and shift it to the back half of the second clause. And you take a portion of the second half of the first clause and shift it over to the first half of the first clause. And that makes an X. The A term goes over here and the B term goes over here, and that makes an X. So a very common and famous one for that is, ask not what your country can do for you, but what you can do for your country. Country, you, country. Another famous one that actually our former president at CWI used to say was, people don't care about how much you know until they know how much you care. All right, so that's chiasmus. It makes an X. A term goes here, B term goes there. First clause and second clause are related but different. Okay, so what have I covered in this lecture with memorable line in this capsule? Quotation. Use the same tips as I taught you earlier in the open with impact, but do not use it if it's right after a tie back to the open, unless you're sure you can do it well. Rhyme, assonance, where things rhyme, don't use it unless it's a lighthearted speech. Figure of speech, alliteration, repetitions of sounds in your clauses. Parallelism, first phrase and second phrase are basically saying the same thing. Antithesis, first clause and second clause are saying opposite things. And then chiasmus, shifting the terms and the clauses. All right, last little thing. Actually, I think I'll wait. I'll do another capsuled lecture for this honey off the tongue. It's super important. I want to make sure it's out there on its own. Okay, all right, take care. Thank you so much for listening.